Andrew Pledger, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs from your home in South Carolina, USA. You are a writer, activist, and a religion recovery coach, as well as the host of the podcast Speaking Up with Andrew Pledger, where you talk to survivors of religious trauma. Well, we have a lot of ground to cover, Andrew, but before we dive into your story, I just have to mention that amongst all the things that keep you busy each day, you're also the social media manager for the Indoctrination podcast with Rachel Bernstein, a mutual friend who's appeared on my show more than once.
Yes, I am very busy. And I absolutely love working for the Indoctrination podcast, and it's a big part of my life and my mission of being vocal about abuse in cults and also religious abuse. So thank you so much for having me on.
Well, today we'll hear about the IFB Church, which you and your family attended, as well as Bob Jones University, a Christian university from which you were ejected, and how your coming out as gay affected all of this. But let's just start with the IFB. Andrew, how would you describe the IFB, and what is your early history with this church?
Yes, so I think it's important to know a little bit about why the IFB started. And for people who do not know what that stands for, IFB stands for Independent Fundamental Baptist. And this movement started in the 1920s, and it was really as a reaction against modernism. So it was fundamentalists against modernists. And this group did not like how science was contradicting a lot of the fundamentals in this extreme Baptist movement. And these churches, they were originally a part of either the Southern Baptist Convention or the American Baptist Convention. And they became independent by removing themselves from those conventions because they felt that those conventions were becoming too liberal. So they wanted to separate and to really push their extremist beliefs, and they really wanted to isolate away from society and anyone who thought differently than them. And the whole purpose to be independent was that there was no higher organization over them. There was no one holding them accountable or knowing what they were doing. They could do whatever they wanted in these independent churches. And that's what they love so much about it. And for me, like how I became a part of this movement was that I was born into it. So the IFB became very popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as these churches started creating IFB colleges, which I use the word college very lightly. They're really indoctrination machines. That's what they really are. And Jack Hyles, he's a big figure in the IFB movement. He had one of the biggest IFB churches in America, and he had a college attached to his church that continued the indoctrination. And this college, which is really big in the 80s, it was called Hyles Anderson College. And this is where my parents met because they graduated from this college. So they were heavily indoctrinated into the IFB cult, and they wanted to continue the tradition of it with their children. So my parents decided to homeschool me and my two brothers our entire lives to end up in this group and then to have our own families and just continue that cycle. And, you know, my dad went to that college to become a pastor, and he was for several years until he left the ministry. And my mom was a Christian school teacher for many years before homeschooling. And in this environment, you are broken down from an early age. You're taught that you are worthless, that you deserve eternal damnation, and you're told that you are your sin is the reason Jesus died on the cross. So they give you all these graphic images in your mind describing these things, and they're like, "Oh, that's your fault. Jesus, he was beaten and nailed to a cross because of you." And from an early age, your humanity is demonized. You are really cut off from your humanity, and they're really trying to stop children from forming their own identity. And they're trying to give, I mean, that's what cults do. They don't let you form an identity, and they give you an identity and a purpose and an agenda to run with. And so, really, what they want you to do is break you down to really not have a free will to live your life the way you want or what you think is best for you. Is all about serving the group. And that's really what my parents wanted for me. I mean, I remember being told by my parents growing up that, no matter what I do, they hope that I'm a full-time Christian. And in their mind, that meant staying in the IFB, going to church when the doors were open, helping with the church, doing a Sunday school class, just being heavily involved with this group. And in this environment, there's a lot of really extremist and hateful teachings. So this group is very anti-LGBTQ plus. I did not hear the term gay or LGBTQ growing up in this environment. It was always sodomites. That's usually the word that they would use, really to demonize and dehumanize the LGBTQ plus
Not same-sex attracted or anything like that. It was sodomites.
Yeah, no, I didn't hear the word same-sex attracted. Wow. Not until my college years, which I can dig into that later. But just saying that gay people deserve to die of awful diseases, that through God, they can be healed from their sickness. Like, these are terms that they used. And looking back, it just blows my mind, because I'm like, there's all these terrible things that are going on in the world, but they believe this God cares enough to even desire, even change someone's sexuality. So that's just crazy to me looking back. But from what I've said, I think it's very obvious that this group is all about fear and shame, and using this to control you. And in this group, they taught that they had the answer to get to heaven and be saved for eternity, and you don't have to go to hell. And it was called the plan of salvation. And all you had to do was admit that you're a sinner, believe in Jesus, that he died on the cross for your sins, and confess your sins, and you're automatically saved. And you don't have to worry about going to hell. But the issue is, they tell you, really, they indoctrinate you to believe that if you don't follow certain standards, then that's a sign that you're most likely not going to heaven, that you're going to hell. And you had to follow the group's rules to feel confident that you were going to heaven. So it was another way to control you and keep you conforming to the group. So signs that you were saved in this group meant you loved going to church whenever the doors are open. You loved giving them your money for tithes. You enjoyed and loved reading your Bible. You loved serving the church. There's all these things that benefited the church or their cause. And those were signs that you were going to heaven. Looking back, it's laughable because I see what a scam it really is. And baptism was another thing. Now, in order to be saved, you didn't necessarily have to get baptized, but if you didn't get baptized, you were disobeying God, and God wasn't going to bless you or be happy with you until you actually got baptized. And, this was a public thing in this cult. And the thing is, all these hateful messages, this like, oh, you're so depraved, you're so evil, you're so wicked, you don't deserve anything good. This was reinforced through homeschooling. And for people who don't realize that a lot of these fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers, they are indoctrinated using a specially made curriculum for fundamentalist Christians that's full of propaganda, full of, I don't want to say science, because it's not, a lot of inaccurate things that like to say it's science.
Yes.
Yes. So a lot of misinformation in this curriculum, and the purpose is to keep this child indoctrinated really into this ideology. And that's an overall gist of the environment that I grew up in.
Well, just over a year ago, you were expelled from the Bob Jones University. Now, this is a Christian university, as we've said, and it's tightly intertwined with the IFB church. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is correct. And it has its roots in the IFB because Bob Jones University, it also started in the 20s, like the IFB movement. And that's why they're intertwined because they both started for the same reason. Bob Jones University started to keep people indoctrinated into fundamentalist Christianity. And really, in the IFB, especially in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, a lot of men in these cults really were greatly encouraged and really coerced at times to become a pastor or a preacher.
Huh.
And so they would send them off to these IFB colleges that had the same exact doctrines and same reasons for starting to keep them indoctrinated into the system and to continue that cycle. So that was originally why Bob Jones started, was to, get their members separated from the outside world and keep them in this bubble and to continue this cycle. Now, it's definitely changed a lot since the 20s, most definitely, and it slowly has unaffiliated itself with the IFB over the years. And even though behind the scenes it still has high control, I think, over it for certain donors that put a lot of money into
Mhm.
the school for the
Okay.
purpose of pushing fundamentalist Christianity. Now, for like a brief history for this, um, Bob Jones University, like before the university, they have a whole academy, like K through 12, that, in this Bob Jones school to keep people indoctrinated and then eventually have them go to the university to continue that indoctrination. And, Christian schools, especially like in the 60s, were started really as segregation to continue that when it was no longer legal. They're like, okay, we'll have Christian schools as a front to have segregation. And Bob Jones University, they didn't allow an African American student to enroll until the early 70s.
Cool.
And this school did not allow interracial dating until 2000.
No.
Uh-huh. That, I'm
That's odd.
serious. It is insane. Yeah. 2000 was when they allowed interracial dating. So this is how behind the times
Wow.
they are. And just, and of course Bob Jones has a bad rap for being sexist, which isn't really a surprise, and blaming women for sexual assaults. And of course they're anti-LGBTQ plus. um, but yeah, this school eventually, as they suffer a decline in attendance, they realized that they needed to be accredited. They needed to actually have a good education. So they are finally were able to be accredited, but that meant that there were certain guidelines that they had to update. And so sadly, this university, they find loopholes to get around with some of their extremist beliefs, especially around their anti-LGBTQ plus stance. But yeah, that's a little brief history of Bob Jones.
So, what was it like attending Bob Jones University?
But yeah, this is definitely a lot to dig into because I was there for 3.5 years until I was expelled from the school. And I think it is important for people to understand the student experience, the day to day life of being there. Bob Jones University really tries to keep their students as busy as they possibly can. And there are a lot of required things you have to do in addition to obviously going to class. So, going to class is obviously expected, I think, of any university to learn. But in addition, really a lot of religious activities that really shouldn't be, I think, required. But of course, since it's a Christian college, they're going to have all these different things. So in addition to that, we have chapel several days a week, and this is usually from like 11 to 11:35 a.m. in the morning, and it's a time to continue that indoctrination. It's usually singing a service, and we all during this time stand up and we say a creed that is really like the fundamental beliefs of this school. And it's really just, it aligns with fundamentalist Christianity. Like believing that the world was created in 7 days, that, God created the world, Jesus died on the cross, he rose again, you know, Jesus was born a virgin, just all these different fundamentals of Christianity we have to repeat in this creed to continue that indoctrination.
I believe in the inspiration of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments, the creation of man by the direct act of God, the incarnation and virgin birth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, his identification as the Son of God, his vicarious atonement for the sins of mankind by his saving his blood on the cross, the resurrection of his body from the tomb, his power to save men from sin, the new birth or regeneration by the Holy Spirit, and the gift of eternal life by the grace of God.
And in addition to chapel, we were required to go to church at least twice a week or 2 services a week. And the way they controlled this was on Sundays, they checked the dorms. Like, you could not be in your dorm or on campus during that time on Sunday morning. And to even they control where you went to church. They had a list of churches that they approved of that you had to choose from that aligned with their ideology. And so, we're exhausted the week doing all these activities, and we have to go to church in addition. Like, there's no rest. And, we also had to join a society. And I'm going to explain what this is for people who aren't familiar. But at Bob Jones, a society, I would say, is the fundamentalist Christian version of a fraternity or a sorority. And just the simplest way to say it, but except it's not fun and it's not cool at all. And it's honestly, it was just like chapel, but run by students. And it was just, I thought it was funny. I'm like, okay, we're coming in here as a smaller group. We're singing, there's a service. And yes, like there might be a game we play, and and outside of those required meetings, a lot of societies did have like recreational sports if you wanted to do that. That's what really, I guess, made it different from everything else.
So it wasn't like drinking and hazing like you get.
No.
I can imagine.
No.
So it's more like church then.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, once a year they would have a Bible conference that we had to go to, and they would take 1 week out of the spring semester where you had no schoolwork, but you had to attend like 3 services a day that were usually like around an hour long. And there was also, they were basically spread out during the day so that you could eat your meal and you could come back for another service. So they kept you really busy during this time. And it was probably my least favorite. Like, I generally hated being there, but that was like the worst, just to have so much all at once, especially packed into that week.
Well, that's what cults do, isn't it? They keep you busy.
Yes. Oh, yes. And in addition to that, we also had to be a part of a discipleship group. This was required. So these were meetings that we would have with a couple dorm rooms, and it would be several nights a week from like 10:30 to like 11. We were required to, and it was, again, continuing the indoctrination of what we were learning in chapel. And like, none of us wanted to be up. We wanted to go to bed or be studying. We didn't want to be up that late. Having to be in this room, having to go through a special book that they made to walk us through, because every discipleship group, they were given a book written by the school to walk you through the chapel messages and the main points and to talk about it. So that indoctrination just continuing. And in addition, you have school, all the different classes that you have, and your own job that you have. So you were just always so busy.
It sounds like they really wanted to keep you in a bubble, Andrews. Would that be a right sort of way to assess it?
Yes. And, since leaving, I have no doubt that Bob Jones University is a cult, most definitely.
So this must have affected your well-being, your mental health, all this. Is that right?
Yes. At Bob Jones, I did struggle a lot with my mental health. And even before going to Bob Jones, I struggled a lot with mental health throughout my teen years. And I was really blamed gaslit and spiritually bypassed a lot for experiencing that. So I learned to hide it. And I struggled with depression, anxiety, and being suicidal in my teen years. And of course, this continued at Bob Jones University. And what I didn't realize was that I was experiencing religious trauma and trauma in general from this extreme ideology and all the messaging and all the different things I was exposed to in the IFB and even at Bob Jones University. But while I was at the school, just being gay and in the closet at that school and trying to hide my sexuality, not being able to be myself, and also dealing with a lot of triggers and really a lot of spiritual abuse from that school and the messages that they perpetuated that were just like the IFB. I mean, it was a lot. And at that time, I didn't know what I was dealing with. I wasn't educated on trauma or religious trauma. I didn't know what was going on. And it wasn't until like midway my college career that I discovered that term and truly started to understand what was going on. But yeah, I was so depressed, so suicidal. And fundamentalist Christianity, they really look down on having those experiences and those feelings. And there's a lot of shame around it. And so I tried to hide that, hide my mental health, hide my sexuality. And, it brought me to the point of almost taking my own life. And it was really a wake-up call for me. And it was because of the trauma, a lot of it, unprocessed trauma from growing up in that kind of extreme environment. And also a lot of unmet needs that I needed as a person. I didn't have community there. I was so lonely, so alone, even though I was surrounded by people, but I couldn't connect with them because I couldn't be authentic and I couldn't talk to anyone about anything personal. I just had to put on a mask or try to. And so for me, it brought me to the point of having to finally claim my autonomy and being like, what, this is toxic. And even though I didn't understand the dynamics or all of it, I was like, I know this is toxic. I need to find community. So long story short, I was able to go to an affirming church, which I was not allowed to go to, but I kept it a secret. And I was able to meet different people, and I met a family there, and we were able to connect, and they really were my emotional support to help me those 3.5 years of being there. And I was able to go to their house a lot because they lived by BJU. And when I was expelled, I moved in with them and started my journey in therapy of working through 22 years of this.
Well, you never got to finish university because, to put it bluntly, they kicked you out. So can you tell us the story of how this happened?
Being expelled from Bob Jones was something I never expected to happen. But what led up to that was that my senior year at Bob Jones was starting. And this was the fall of 2021, so nearly a year ago, or a little over a year ago. And at that point, I had done a lot of questioning of fundamentalist Christianity. I've done a lot of research and deconstructing that background, and I officially left that faith, but hadn't become public about it. So here I am in the closet as really agnostic at that point for me personally, not believing in that specific belief system anymore, and dealing and knowing that I have religious trauma after finding that term and understanding all the years of psychological abuse and really emotional abuse from that environment. And I had to get it out. So I was a photography major there, and I created a photo series that expressed my journey of dealing with religious trauma throughout my life. And the series told a story of a person escaping a toxic religious environment and finding their autonomy. I mean, it was representing my internal journey, but I was ready for it to become external publicly. And so when I made this series, I made it at Bob Jones University secretly, and I published it in January of 2022, so almost a year ago. And I was interviewed by an author, and his name is Josh Harris. And for people who aren't familiar with him, he wrote this book that was very influential in evangelical and fundamentalist circles, and it was called I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Oh, yeah.
And it really influenced purity culture. And long story short, he publicly left Christianity and apologized and really became an influencer online, bring awareness to deconstruction and giving a voice to people who grew up in this toxic environment. And I went on his IG live to tell my story. And I tried to prevent people from Bob Jones from seeing it, but it didn't work. But I was expelled because of that interview where I publicly came out of the closet and I told my story of religious trauma and all that I've been through throughout my life and talking about this series. And I was expelled because they told me, oh, well, you don't align with our beliefs anymore. So we're going to expel you from the school. And that is why I was expelled from Bob Jones.
I think part of you must have felt relief. I mean, maybe part of you actually wanted to, or sort of subconsciously wanted to get expelled by making this photo series. What do you think?
I think subconsciously, yes. And this is something I've dug into therapy about, but there wasn't part of me that needed to get out so desperately because I was, emotionally and psychologically, like I was internally dying. I was not flourishing as a person. I was suffering with my mental health. And this was me trying to really be seen, heard, and understood because I didn't experience that at all growing up. And as people, if you have true community, you need to be seen, you need to be heard, you need to be understood. And I never had that. And internally, I felt it was time to tell my story. It was time to share my journey that I was no longer going to suffer in silence.
And you had to tell your family. What was their reaction and your friends and fellow students? Yeah. What did they think when they heard this?
Yeah, so the reaction to it, first, I was really surprised by BJU students' reactions. It was mostly positivity that was sent towards me online through DMs and comments. And so I was really pleased by that because I was ready for the worst case scenario for that. And for my parents, they were really shocked. They were speechless about it happening because I had always been the people pleaser, goody two shoes who never did anything wrong, always tried to be perfect. Yeah. And to have that happen was a surprise. And, when I had to tell them I was expelled, I was like, I told my story of all the trauma from this background. Yeah. And what it's done to me. And they, understandably, I don't think they couldn't emotionally deal with that or process it. So they tried to find something to blame, to not hold themselves accountable or not to deal with those hard emotions. And so they just really started gaslighting me and blaming me and saying that, oh, we think you're bipolar, you need to get on medication, you're on something's wrong with you. That wasn't true though, as I went to my therapist, because that's what I needed. I knew I needed therapy. And they were like, yeah, they're like, you've been through a lot of trauma. And they're like, I don't, and he went through my behavior, my past. And he's like, yeah, it's like, I don't see signs of bipolar at all. So that was great to get that validation because I did doubt my own reality for a little bit because that's what they were trying to do and trying not to hold themselves accountable. And for relatives, most of my relatives were just silent about it, which honestly didn't surprise me. Like, there may be a few that I think commented online that were somewhat compassionate, but otherwise most of them have been silent. And like for friends, I lost a lot of friends from Bob Jones. There were maybe 2 of them that I have kept or been able to keep up with since, but I was okay with losing a lot of friends from that environment because they weren't real or genuine relationships. It was just based on what we believed, not for who we were as people. Yeah. And it was hard, but I mean, it's been quite a transition this year, but I've continued my education by transferring my credits to another school, and I'm set to graduate in May. And I'm excited to be working towards becoming a therapist and eventually a psychologist to help cult survivors and to research religious trauma.
Well, thankfully, you were able to pick up the pieces and move on. Now, part of this recovery has been your acceptance into college, where you're currently studying for a bachelor's degree. But you also did some research into the IFB Church. So What has that research revealed?
It was interesting to me to leave that environment. And at first, I'm like, oh, that was just a crazy group, extreme group. And really, working for Rachel Bernstein really made me dig into cult research and to understand the dynamics. And I think that is an important part of cult recovery, because to really prevent us from going to another cult or from someone manipulating us and bringing us to another cultic group. And to me, when you grow up in this environment, you have a very black and white mindset. It stays with you until you actually begin to work on undoing that. So I had a very black and white view of what the term cult meant. I thought it was just the worst possible case scenario. I didn't realize there's a spectrum of like control in these groups. And really, as I learned about Stephen Hassan's BITE model, behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control, and then Lifton's criteria for thought reform. And once I started researching this, when you read about it, especially for me, it was Lifton's criteria. And there were several points in that when I'm reading about it, I made connections to the IFB. And one of the biggest things that like caught my attention immediately was Lipton's criteria, which is called sacred science. And it's where the group claims that it has the truth. It's the only way, and you can't question it. And the IFB was like that. They claimed that the KJV Bible, the King James Version, was the only legitimate version of the Bible, and all other Bibles were tainted or are influenced by Satan, and that their message of salvation was the only way to heaven, that they were it, they were the answer. So that stuck out to me, having them, claim that they're the only way. And another point of his criteria is demand for purity. And basically that means that you have to follow the group's rules perfectly. If you don't, you have to confess either to someone in the group or to God or yourself. And you're so encouraged to constantly indoctrinate yourself where you're gone outside of it, to have all these strict rules around your life about, where do parents send their kids to school? Okay, what media are they exposed to? What books are they exposed to? What information? So much control in all these other aspects of your life. And like, we weren't allowed to be friends with people outside the belief system. It was, again, and this is another aspect, it's called dispensing of existence, that it doesn't matter what people outside the group say. They don't have the truth, or they're not enlightened. And anything anyone says outside the group doesn't matter, because they're not in. That person is out. So this us versus them mindset. And they have to do this to deal with that cognitive dissonance that happens when someone speaks out against what they're doing. They have to demonize them to really keep people on the inside indoctrinated and to keep them confident in their belief system. And, I think that's a little gist. There are more things I could dig into. I could talk an hour or so about why it is.
I'm just going to ask Andrew, what about, Steve Hassan talks about loaded language. I mean, did you have terminology?
Oof. Yeah.
Give us one or two examples of any weird terminology that IFB or Bob Jones came up with.
Yeah. So for different terminology, I think worldly is a term that's used a lot in that group, and it demonizes the outside world. Worldly means any ideology or anything that doesn't conform to the group's standards. So, and it's interesting because they would talk about how, you could be a worldly Christian about you're trying to straddle both worlds, and you can't do that. You can't, they taught this extreme, you're either with God or you're with Satan. You can't be a both. And so, of Satan was not living exactly to the group's rules. Yeah. And I think they called it lukewarm. I think that's in the Bible, about trying to get the best of both worlds. And I think other language inside that group was like lost or saved. And some other groups have similar language and it means different things to different groups. But for the IFB, like saved meant you followed the plan of salvation, you have a secure spot in heaven. And lost was a way to describe people who weren't in the group who didn't believe its ideology. And those are a few examples of some of the loaded language in that group.
Today, you are very active on social media. We hear a lot from you on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and your podcast. You've explored your own experiences with religious trauma in a photo story, which can be viewed in full on your website. So what's life like for you now, Andrew? You seem to be up to your eyes, but you definitely seem to be enjoying it.
Yes, I think for anyone who hears my story, I want them to know that you can live a happy and fulfilling life outside of the cult or outside of the high control group that you're in. And I think another message I want people to hear from my story is that you are your own hero. And I had to learn to claim my autonomy and go seek the things that I needed as a person outside of that group. And it was scary, not gonna lie. But I'm where I am today because I looked for help outside that group and I found it. And for me, being able to have friends where I can be myself, where I can be authentic, and I don't have to hide anything. And the fact that I'm in therapy and working through 22 years of being in that environment and all that trauma has been incredible. Going online and becoming an activist through social media by bringing awareness to religious trauma, cults, and deconstruction, and dealing with your mental health through all of these hard things, and becoming a religion recovery coach, trying to help people also through this journey of questioning, and working for Rachel Bernstein on her podcast Indoctrination is such a big part of it too, because I need a job that has purpose. And our missions align, and I love being able to continue to help people through that. And I think for anyone listening that there are resources out there, and there needs to be more for cult survivors. But what I suggest for people, and which I know this is hard because of the control that they have, even getting access to the internet, I know can be so hard at times in these kinds of groups. But for me, just connecting with people in the survivor and activist community online, and having that person who understands what you've been through, who will listen and validate and understand and know that there is a much better life on the other side.
It really is inspiring how you've turned your life around, Andrew, and the work you're doing is hugely important. I will leave links to your social media and podcast in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
I want to thank you again so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed this, and I love the work that you're doing. And for anyone out there who is watching this or listening, and you need someone to talk to, please reach out to me on social media, and I'll be more than happy to talk with you.